At 4:17 in the morning, I found my cousins carrying my grandfather's war trunk down the back steps of his house. They had wrapped it in a moving blanket and tied it with orange rope, but I knew its shape immediately. I had known that trunk since childhood. The dented brass corners, the dark green paint, the small white numbers Grandpa had stenciled across the lid after coming home from Korea. What I did not know was why Daniel and Scott were loading it into the van of an antique steedsdealer before sunrise, or why the dealer had brought a portable document scanner, or why my grandfather's probate attorney was sitting in a black sedan across the street with the engine running. I stood beneath the weak yellow porch light, holding a paper bag of cleaning supplies, and for several seconds nobody moved. Then Daniel smiled at me. Not nervously, not guiltily, politely. "Claire," he said, as if we had met by accident in a grocery store. "You're here early." I looked past him at the trunk. The rope had been cut once and tied again. One of the old brass latches was hanging open. "You told me the estate sale started at 9. It does. Then why are you selling Grandpa's trunk at 4 in the morning? Scott shifted his weight. The antiques dealer stared at the pavement. Daniel kept smiling. "It's just an old military box. The buyer has a long drive." That was when I saw a corner of cream-colored paper trapped beneath the lid. It bore the blue seal of a bank that had not existed for almost 30 years. I did not know it yet, but that paper would lead to a hidden trust, a sealed room, and more money than anyone in my family had ever imagined. It would also prove that my grandfather had spent the last years of his life preparing for a betrayal he believed would come from inside his own family. Good day, dear listeners. It's Nora again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please subscribe to my channel and like this video, and also let me know in the comments which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. My name is Claire Bennett. I was 42 years old when my grandfather died, and I worked as a billing auditor for a regional hospital system in Columbus, Ohio. People sometimes hear the word auditor and imagine someone cold, suspicious, and obsessed with catching mistakes. That was never how I saw my work. Numbers are not cruel. Records are not judgmental. They simply remember what people hope will be forgotten. Most errors begin quietly. A date entered in the wrong field, a payment sent twice, a missing signature, a code that looks ordinary until you compare it with the code beside it. My job taught me that fraud rarely announces itself with a dramatic lie. It usually hides inside a pattern of small explanations that almost make sense. That lesson saved me. At the time, my life was not remarkable. I rented a 2-bedroom duplex in Clintonville with a narrow kitchen and a backyard just large enough for 3 tomato plants. I drove a 9-year-old Honda. I packed my lunch most mornings and took my coffee in a blue travel cup with a cracked handle. I had been divorced for 6 years. My former husband, Evan, was not a villain. He was simply a man who had slowly built a life that did not include me, then acted surprised when I noticed. There had been another woman near the end. Though by then the marriage had already become an empty room we both walked through carefully. The divorce left me cautious but not bitter. I had no children, which some relatives treated as a tragedy and others treated as evidence that I was always available to help them move. Grandpa Arthur never did either. He treated my life as complete because it belonged to me. He lived 70 miles away in Bellwether, a small Ohio town where the courthouse had white columns. The diner closed at 8, and everyone knew which families had stopped speaking before those families admitted it themselves. His house stood at the edge of town on 3 wooded acres. It was a modest brick ranch with a deep basement and a detached workshop that smelled of cedar shavings and motor oil. Grandpa had bought it after returning from military service. He raised my mother and her younger brother there. After Grandma June died, he lived alone for another 18 years. He had habits that never changed. Coffee at 6, mail opened with a brass letter knife, bills paid on the first Sunday of the month, every receipt saved in a labeled envelope, every tool returned to the same hook. As a child, I thought his orderliness came from age. As an adult, I understood it was how he kept the world from surprising him. The war trunk sat in his basement beneath the stairs. It was heavy, ugly, and always locked. When I was 9, I asked him what was inside. "Things I survived," he said. At 12, I asked again. Things I don't need to survive twice. That answer stayed with me. My cousins treated the trunk differently. Daniel and Scott were Uncle Robert's sons, both older than I was, both raised to believe every closed door concealed something owed to them. Daniel became a commercial real estate broker. He wore tailored jackets, drove leased luxury cars, and remembered everyone's birthday if he thought they might become useful later. Scott moved through a series of businesses: roofing, supplements, online investments, private vehicle sales. None lasted long, though he always spoke as if the next one would make him wealthy. Their father, Robert, was my mother's younger brother. My mother died from ovarian cancer when I was 35. Grandpa and I became closer after that. I visited twice a month, handled online bill payments when his eyesight weakened, and drove him to appointments when the winter roads were bad. Daniel and Scott visited less often, but they called, usually about the house. Grandpa shouldn't be maintaining that property alone. The land is worth more than he thinks. A developer would pay cash. Grandpa always refused. The last time Daniel raised the subject at Thanksgiving, Grandpa set down his fork and said, "A thing is not yours merely because you have calculated its price." Daniel laughed. Grandpa did not. 6 months before his death, Grandpa fell in the kitchen and fractured his wrist. He recovered, but something changed afterward. He became watchful. He began checking the locks twice. He stopped discussing finances over the phone. He asked me whether hospital billing systems recorded every person who opened a patient's file. Yes, I told him. Access logs show who looked, when they looked, and what they changed. He nodded slowly. Good systems remember hands. At the time, I thought he was making conversation. A week later, he handed me a small brass key attached to a blank paper tag. "What does it open?" I asked. "Something you are not ready to open." "Grandpa, that sounds unnecessarily mysterious." "It probably is," I smiled, but he did not. He placed the key in my palm and folded my fingers around it. "If men are in a hurry after I die, Claire, slow them down." I asked what he meant. He looked toward the hallway, though we were alone. "Urgency is useful when a house is burning. In business, it usually means someone does not want you to read." I put the key in the zippered pocket of my purse. 3 weeks later, I received a call from a woman who identified herself as an assistant at Lakeview Community Bank. She asked whether I was authorized to discuss Arthur Bennett's safe deposit arrangements. I told her I was not. There was a pause. "Then I apologize," she said. "Our records may contain an outdated contact instruction." "What instruction?" "I'm not permitted to say without verification." When I told Grandpa about the call, his face went still. "Did she give a name?" I did. He wrote it down on the back of a grocery receipt. Then he asked me to forget the conversation. That was the first warning sign. The second came 2 months later, when I noticed a payment from Grandpa's checking account to Heritage Estate Solutions for $9,800. I had limited access to help him pay household bills, but I did not monitor every transaction. Grandpa valued privacy and I respected it. Still, the company name caught my attention. I asked whether he had hired someone to prepare the house for sale. "No." "Did you pay an estate planning service?" "No." I turned my laptop toward him. He studied the transaction. Then he said something that made the room feel colder. "I did not authorize that." I called the bank with him sitting beside me. The payment had been initiated using a signed paper authorization submitted in person. Grandpa requested a copy. The signature looked like his, but the final stroke of the A leaned in the wrong direction. Most people would not have noticed. Grandpa did. "So they've started practicing," he said. "Who?" He closed the folder. "Not yet." I was frustrated with him. I told him secrecy made it harder to help. He apologized, but he did not explain. Instead, he asked me to print the transaction record, the authorization form, and the name of the bank employee who processed it. I did. He placed everything in a gray folder and wrote one word on the tab: "First." For the next several weeks, nothing happened. The bank refunded the money while investigating. Heritage Estate Solutions claimed the payment had been connected to a preliminary property assessment ordered by a family representative. They refused to name the representative without legal process. Grandpa hired an attorney named Malcolm Price. That surprised me because Malcolm had been the family's probate lawyer for years. He had handled Grandma's estate and helped Grandpa update his will after my mother died. Grandpa asked me to drive him to one appointment. Malcolm's office occupied the second floor of a renovated building across from the county courthouse. The waiting room had leather chairs, framed newspaper articles, and a coffee machine that produced something brown and bitter. Malcolm was in his early 60s, silver-haired and soft-spoken. He had the reassuring manner of a man who never raised his voice because other people were already listening. He greeted Grandpa warmly. Then he asked me to wait outside. That was normal. Attorney-client privilege mattered. What was not normal was seeing Daniel leave through the rear parking lot 10 minutes later. He noticed me through the window. He did not wave. When Grandpa emerged from the office, I asked why Daniel had been there. Malcolm represents many people. Was Daniel part of your meeting? No. Do you trust Malcolm? Grandpa looked back at the closed office door. I trust paper more than men. He died on a Thursday morning in October. A neighbor found him in his armchair with the television on and a library book open beside him. The medical examiner said it was a heart attack. There was no reason to suspect anything else. I remember standing in his kitchen that afternoon while the refrigerator hummed and the clock above the sink clicked forward as if time had not noticed. Grief is strange in an orderly house. Everything remains where the person left it. The coffee grounds are still in the container. The coat is still hanging by the door. The handwriting on the grocery list still expects another week. I sat at Grandpa's kitchen table for a long time. Daniel arrived before sunset with Malcolm Price. Scott came 20 minutes later. Uncle Robert did not come. He had been living in Florida for several years and said his blood pressure made travel difficult. Malcolm carried a brown leather case. He offered his condolences, then explained that Grandpa's most recent will divided the estate equally between Uncle Robert and me. Since my mother had died, I would receive her half. That seemed simple. The house would be sold. Personal belongings would be distributed or auctioned. Remaining financial accounts would be divided after expenses. Daniel asked whether his father could assign him authority to manage the sale. Malcolm said yes. I said I wanted time. Daniel put a hand on my shoulder. Of course. We all do. But by the next morning, he had scheduled an estate appraisal. By Saturday, he had hired Heritage Estate Solutions, the same company connected to the unauthorized payment. When I objected, Daniel explained that Grandpa had apparently considered hiring them earlier. That payment was disputed, I said. A misunderstanding, Daniel replied. The bank concluded it was unauthorized. The bank refunded it to keep a client happy. That doesn't prove anything. His answer was too smooth. Like a figure entered into the wrong column with a note beside it saying adjustment. I called Malcolm. He told me Daniel had authority from Uncle Robert to protect Robert's 50% interest and that routine appraisal activity did not require my consent. Nothing will be sold without proper notice, he said. Then why is Heritage already photographing everything? Efficiency should not be mistaken for misconduct. That sentence stayed with me. On Monday, Malcolm emailed a proposed estate sale agreement. It included a clause allowing private pre-sale offers on specialty items before the public sale. I objected in writing. He replied that my concerns were noted. The sale was scheduled for Friday. Thursday night, I could not sleep. At 3:30 in the morning, I got out of bed, made coffee, and decided to Grandpa's house before work. I told myself I wanted to remove his personal letters before strangers arrived. The truth was simpler. Something felt wrong. By 4:17, I was standing under the back porch light, watching my cousins sell the war trunk. Daniel said the buyer had made an offer of $1,200. I looked at the antiques dealer. Is that true? He hesitated. Daniel answered for him. It's a fair price. Then it can wait until 9. Scott stepped between me and the trunk. You're creating a problem over a box. No, I said. You created the problem by moving estate property before the sale. Malcolm's sedan remained across the street. I took out my phone and photographed the van, the license plate, the trunk, the cut rope, and Malcolm's car. Daniel's smile disappeared. You don't need to document family. Then family should stop giving me things to document. I called the sheriff's non-emergency number. That changed everything. The antiques dealer left immediately. Malcolm drove away before the deputy arrived. Daniel said I was emotional from grief. I let him speak. The deputy made a report and instructed everyone to leave the trunk in the house until ownership could be clarified. When Daniel and Scott finally departed, I carried the cleaning supplies inside and locked the doors. The house was silent again. I went to the basement. The trunk sat beneath the stairs, no longer wrapped. The brass latch had been forced with something thin. A fresh scratch crossed the lid near the lock. I took the small key from my purse. It fit. The lock opened with a stiff metallic snap. For a moment, I could not lift the lid. It was not fear exactly. It was the weight of every time Grandpa had refused to open it. Then I remembered what he had told me. If men are in a hurry after I die, slow them down. I raised the lid. The smell came first: cedar, metal, and old paper. On top lay a folded military jacket, carefully brushed and wrapped in tissue. Beneath it were medals, photographs, letters tied with cotton string, and a field notebook filled with Grandpa's compact handwriting. None of that explained the bank paper I had seen. I removed a shallow wooden tray. Underneath was a false bottom. The brass key fit a second lock hidden along the inner wall. When I turned it, the bottom lifted half an inch. Inside were 6 document envelopes, a smaller steel cash box, 2 flash drives, and a sealed letter with my name written across the front. My hands began to shake. The first envelope contained copies of property records. Not for Grandpa's house, for a parcel of industrial land outside Bellwether, owned by a company called North Meridian Holdings. The second held bank statements from a trust account with a balance of $11,400,000. I read the number 3 times. The third contained stock certificates and records of royalty payments from a manufacturing patent registered in 1978. The fourth contained a notarized trust amendment naming me as successor trustee and primary beneficiary. The fifth contained photographs of signed documents beside a ruler, as if someone had been measuring handwriting. The sixth held copies of emails between Daniel, Malcolm Price, and a private lending company. One subject line read, "Arthur Bennett Asset Consolidation Before Competency Review." I sat on the basement floor with the papers around me. The steel cash box contained 2 original deeds, a digital recorder, and a second key attached to a tag-marked room. The letter with my name was only 1 page. "Claire, if you are reading this, they moved faster than I hoped. Do not take these papers to Malcolm. Do not confront Daniel. Call the number written inside the field notebook under March 14. Trust records, not reassurance. I am sorry I left you a burden disguised as an inheritance." Grandpa, I read it again. Then I heard a car door close outside. I switched off the basement light and stood in darkness. Footsteps crossed the porch. Someone tried the back door once, then again, harder. My phone showed no signal in the basement. I gathered the most important papers, the flash drives, the recorder, and Grandpa's letter. I placed them inside my canvas work bag. The doorknob upstairs turned slowly. A polite knock followed. "Claire," Daniel called. "I know you're inside." I did not answer. "We should talk before this becomes unnecessarily complicated." His voice was calm. That frightened me more than anger would have. I waited. After a minute, he knocked again. Then he walked around the house, testing windows. I stood with one hand over my mouth, listening to gravel move beneath his shoes. Finally, the footsteps faded. His car remained outside for another 10 minutes. Then it left. Fear is strange. It does not always make you small. Sometimes it makes the world precise. I noticed the dust on the basement steps, the faint oil stain beneath the trunk, the sound of the furnace starting, the exact pressure of the flash drive inside my closed fist. I was not brave. I was careful. I photographed every layer of the trunk before removing anything else. I recorded a video showing the false bottom and the location of each envelope. I placed the remaining items back as I had found them and locked the trunk. Then I left through the front door and drove directly to a 24-hour diner beside the interstate. I sat in a booth beneath fluorescent lights with my work bag against my legs and ordered coffee I did not drink. The field notebook was filled with dates, initials, and short observations. March 14 had one entry: Eleanor Shaw, Barrett & Shaw, Cincinnati, Trust Litigation. Tell her Arthur Bennett sent you. Use June's birthday. A phone number followed. At 6:15, I called and left a message. At 6:42, Eleanor Shaw called me back. She listened without interrupting. Then she asked, "Are the original documents currently secure?" They're with me. Has anyone else seen them? My cousins may know they exist. Do not return them to the house. Do not scan them on a work computer. Do not email them. Place them in a bank box or bring them directly to my office. What is this about? I can't answer that responsibly until I review the documents. Did you know my grandfather? Yes. How there? Was a pause. I represented him in a matter he did not want handled in Bellwether. That was when I understood Grandpa had not trusted his own probate lawyer for some time. I called my supervisor and took a personal day. By 9:30, I was sitting in Eleanor's office on the 21st floor of a downtown building overlooking the Ohio River. She was 57, with short gray hair and dark glasses. Her office was quiet, almost severe. No family photographs, no decorative scales of justice. Just shelves, files, and a large table built for reading. She reviewed the documents for more than 2 hours. She used gloves for the originals. She created an evidence log. She had her assistant witness the transfer. That attention to procedure steadied me. At noon, she closed the last folder. Your grandfather established the Bennett Legacy Trust in 1984, she said. Its principal assets were royalty income securities and land. He amended it several times. The current terms leave a substantial majority to you, with smaller educational and charitable distributions. Why wasn't it mentioned in the will? Because trust assets do not pass through probate. Did Malcolm know? He knew a trust existed. He should not have had access to the current schedule of assets, but he did. It appears so. She pointed to the emails. Daniel had been trying to arrange a loan against North Meridian's industrial property. To do that, he needed control of the trust or evidence that Grandpa lacked the mental capacity to manage it. Malcolm had drafted a petition for emergency guardianship. The petition claimed Grandpa had become confused, paranoid, and financially vulnerable. It cited the disputed heritage payment as proof that he could no longer manage his affairs. The payment they had forged was going to become evidence against him. The pattern was almost elegant. Create the symptom. Use the symptom to obtain control, then call the theft protection. What would have happened if Grandpa had lived longer? I asked. They might have filed for guardianship. If successful, someone appointed by the court could have gained access to his assets. And after he died, they appear to have shifted strategies. She showed me a draft affidavit prepared for Uncle Robert. It alleged that Grandpa intended to revoke the trust but died before signing the final paperwork. Attached was an unsigned revocation instrument. Malcolm had created it. Daniel had sent an email saying, once the trunk materials are neutralized, Robert's statement should carry the estate. Neutralized. That was their word for my grandfather's records. Eleanor looked at me over the documents. They were not selling the trunk for $1,200. They were buying its disappearance. She nodded. The antiques dealer, she suspected, had been hired to remove the trunk under the appearance of an estate sale. The portable scanner would allow them to copy anything useful before destroying or concealing the originals. I sat there for a long time. $11 million should have been the largest fact in the room. It was not. The largest fact was that men I had eaten Thanksgiving dinner with had planned to erase my grandfather's final decisions before his body was even buried. Money was only the measurement. Betrayal was the actual cost. Eleanor advised me not to contact Daniel, Scott, Malcolm, or Uncle Robert. She arranged secure storage for the original documents and hired a forensic examiner to image the flash drives. Then she gave me a yellow legal pad. Write down everything you remember. Dates, words, who stood where, what cars you saw, what documents you touched. Memory changes after confrontation. Do it now. I began with the unauthorized payment, then the bank call, then Daniel leaving Malcolm's office, then Grandpa's warning, then the trunk. The list filled 9 pages. At the bottom of the last page, Eleanor drew a line. From this point forward, she said, do not guess. We separate what you know, what you suspect, and what can be proved. That was language I understood. In auditing, suspicion begins the review. Evidence completes it. The first evidence came from the digital recorder. Most of the files were ordinary. Grandpa describing household repairs, notes about medication, reminders about taxes. Then the examiner found a recording dated 6 weeks before his death. Malcolm's voice was clear. You should simplify, Arthur. Transfer management to Robert while you still have the option to do it privately. Grandpa replied, Robert did not ask for this. His sons are concerned. His sons are interested. Malcolm's tone remained gentle. There is no shame in recognizing that age changes judgment. My judgment is why you're sitting there. A chair moved. Then Daniel spoke. I had not known he was in the room. You're making Claire responsible for a structure she doesn't understand. She understands records. She works in hospital billing. She knows the difference between service and extraction. Daniel laughed softly. This doesn't need to become hostile. Grandpa answered. Hostility is often what polite men call refusal. The recording ended 2 minutes later. The flash drives contained scanned contracts, tax returns, trust amendments, and photographs of meetings. One folder was labeled Hands. Inside were security camera stills from Grandpa's bank. Daniel was shown entering on the day the heritage authorization was amended. Another image showed Malcolm meeting with the bank vice president later that afternoon. The metadata had been preserved. Eleanor subpoenaed the full bank records after filing an emergency action in probate court to protect the trust and stop the estate sale. The judge issued a temporary restraining order. No property could be sold, no documents could be removed, no trust related to transaction could proceed. That afternoon, Daniel called me. I did not answer. He left a voicemail. Claire, I understand you've involved an outside attorney. I'm sure this is grief and confusion, and I don't blame you. But filing public allegations could damage Grandpa's reputation and create tax consequences you may not understand. Call me before people turn this into something ugly. I forwarded the message to Eleanor. An hour later, Scott sent a text. Dad's devastated. You're trying to steal Grandpa's estate from his only living son. I did not reply. That evening, Uncle Robert called. I almost ignored it. Then I remembered Eleanor's instruction to document pressure. Ohio law allowed me to record a conversation I was part of. I started the recorder before answering. Robert sounded tired. Claire, sweetheart, what are you doing? I'm protecting the trust. What trust? The one Grandpa created. A long silence followed. Then he sighed. Your grandfather made many plans. Some were outdated. The amendment is notarized. He changed his mind. Where is the signed revocation? Malcolm has the paperwork. Signed paperwork. His voice hardened slightly. You've always been very literal. I work with records. This is family, not a billing dispute. That sentence told me more than he intended. People often reject procedure when procedure is the only thing preventing them from taking what they want. Robert said Grandpa had promised to divide everything equally among the grandchildren. I asked when. He said several years earlier. I asked who heard it. He said Malcolm. I asked whether it was written. He told me I sounded cruel. Then his tone softened again. Daniel says you may be able to receive a generous settlement. Enough to pay off a home and never worry. You don't need to carry the responsibility of all this. How much? $2 million. In exchange, I would withdraw the court filing, disclaim my position as trustee, and allow Robert to administer the trust. They were offering me $2 million to walk away from assets they claimed did not belong to me. That contradiction mattered. I said, send the proposal through counsel. Robert became quiet. You're making this colder than it needs to be. No, I'm making it written. He hung up. The investigation widened. County records showed Daniel's company had entered an option agreement with a logistics developer 18 months earlier. The agreement gave the developer the right to purchase North Meridian's land for $22 million if Daniel obtained authority to sell it. Daniel had already accepted a $600,000 advance. If he failed to deliver control of the property, he owed the money back with penalties. He had used most of the advance to cover debts from 2 failed commercial projects. That created motive. The bank records created method. A vice president named Calvin Roque had approved access to confidential trust information after Malcolm presented an old authorization letter. The authorization had expired 12 years earlier. Roque had also approved the forged heritage payment without calling Grandpa. In return, Daniel's company had routed consulting fees to a business owned by Roque's wife. The amounts were not enormous. $40,000, then $65,000, then $30,000. Fraud often looks smaller in pieces. That is why records matter. You do not ask whether one number is shocking. You ask whether the numbers form a system. Eleanor brought in a forensic accountant named Marcus Bell. He traced the consulting payments, the developer advance, the heritage invoice, and transfers from Daniel's business account to Scott. Scott had received $75,000 2 days before trying to remove the trunk. The antiques dealer had received $10,000. Malcolm's law firm had received a strategic transaction retainer of $180,000 from the developer. The first concrete proof of conspiracy came from an email Daniel thought he had deleted. The forensic examiner recovered it from one of Grandpa's flash drives because Grandpa had accessed Daniel's abandoned tablet during a visit and copied a synced folder. The message was from Malcolm. Once Arthur is gone, timing will be essential. Probate authority must be established before Claire understands the distinction between estate property and trust property. The military trunk should be treated as personal effects and removed during initial inventory. Avoid direct destruction until contents are reviewed. I read that message 3 times. Once Arthur is gone, not if he loses capacity, not if negotiations fail. Once he is gone. I asked Eleanor whether that meant they had caused his death. She answered carefully, "There is currently no evidence of that. Would they have benefited from it? Yes. Can we investigate? We can request medical and pharmacy records, but we do not accuse without proof." The medical examiner reviewed the case again. Grandpa's death was consistent with natural cardiac arrest. His medications were accounted for. There were no suspicious toxicology findings. Part of me felt relief. Another part felt ashamed that I had needed to ask. Betrayal changes the shape of every memory. It makes ordinary shadows look deliberate. That is another reason evidence matters. It protects us not only from other people's lies, but from our own fear. 2 weeks after the restraining order, Daniel appeared at my duplex. It was raining lightly. He stood beneath the porch light in a charcoal coat, holding no umbrella. I did not open the door. "What do you want?" I asked through the glass. "To talk without lawyers, no." "Claire, I'm not here to threaten you. I didn't say you were." He looked past me into the hallway. "You've always been sensible. That's why Grandpa trusted you. He trusted me to slow you down." For the first time, anger moved across his face. It disappeared quickly. "You found the letter." I said nothing. That trunk contained private family information. Some of it could hurt people who had nothing to do with this. Then their lawyers can explain that to mine. This is bigger than you understand. You keep saying that, because it's true. That land transaction creates jobs. Contracts have been signed. Investors are involved. If you disrupt it, people lose money. You signed contracts for property you did not control. I signed based on assurances. From Malcolm, he looked toward the street. From Grandpa, show me. His jaw tightened. Not everything important is written. That is unfortunate for you. He stepped closer to the door. Your mother would not have wanted you to destroy the family. There it was. Not a threat. A key placed into an old wound. I rested my hand against the doorframe. My mother taught me to return money when a cashier gave me too much change. She taught me that being related to someone does not make dishonesty loving. You think you're morally superior because you audit invoices? No. I think records do not care who feels superior. He lowered his voice. Take the settlement, you'll be safe. You can buy a house, travel, live quietly. Safe from what? He realized his mistake. The rain tapped against the porch roof. I meant safe financially. No, you didn't. He stared at me for several seconds. Then the professional smile returned. You should consider how public litigation affects everyone. I have. Your divorce records could become relevant. Your work history. Your mother's medical debts. Grandpa's mental decline. My divorce is public. My work is audited. My mother's bills were paid. And Grandpa recorded you. That stopped him. I did not know whether Eleanor would have approved of revealing the recording. Probably not, but I wanted to see his reaction. His face did not collapse. People like Daniel do not collapse when confronted with truth. They calculate. How much did he record? Good night, Daniel. I closed the inner door. The next morning, his attorney offered $4 million. We declined, not because I wanted more, because the proposal required confidentiality, destruction of copied records, release of all claims, and resignation as trustee. They were not buying peace, they were buying evidence. The point of no return came during discovery. Eleanor obtained Malcolm's document management logs. Every legal document created by his firm carried hidden metadata: author name, creation date, revision history, prior file names. The unsigned trust revocation had supposedly been prepared at Grandpa's request in January. Metadata showed it was created 3 days after Grandpa died. Its original file name was Bennett Fallback Revocation. The draft guardianship petition had been edited by Daniel. The affidavit for Uncle Robert had first been titled Robert Pressure Version. The estate sale agreement had been revised to add the private pre-sale clause at 2:11 in the morning, on the day before the attempted removal of the trunk. Calvin Roque's bank access logs showed he opened Grandpa's trust file 37 times without a business reason. And then we found the document that ended Malcolm's professional career. It was a fee-sharing memo. Malcolm would receive 3% of the net land transaction if the trust challenge succeeded. A lawyer who claimed to represent the estate had secretly tied his compensation to defeating the estate plan. The truth has a weight of its own. For weeks, Daniel and Malcolm had filled the room with explanations. Concern, efficiency, family intention, economic opportunity, mental decline. But once the documents were laid beside each other, the explanations could no longer carry themselves. Malcolm withdrew as probate counsel. The court appointed a neutral administrator. The state disciplinary authority opened an investigation. The bank suspended Calvin Roque. The developer sued Daniel for fraud. Then Uncle Robert changed his story. In a sworn affidavit, he claimed Daniel had misled him. He said he believed Grandpa had truly intended to revoke the trust, and that Malcolm had assured him the paperwork was valid. Daniel responded by producing text messages showing Robert knew about the plan months earlier. One message said, "Arthur will never sign while Claire's around. We may have to establish control another way. Family betrayal rarely travels in one direction. Once people begin saving themselves, loyalty becomes another asset to liquidate." The civil deposition took place 4 months after Grandpa's death. We sat in a conference room with a long walnut table and windows overlooking a parking garage. Daniel wore a navy suit. Malcolm wore gray. Robert attended by video from Florida. A court reporter sat at the end of the table, recording every word. Depositions are not dramatic in the way television makes them dramatic. There is no jury, no raised gavel, no sudden music. There are questions, there are pauses. There are documents placed carefully in front of people who once believed they would never have to explain them. Eleanor questioned Daniel first. She began with the land option. "Did you have authority to sell property owned by North Meridian Holdings?" "I believed authority would be granted." "By whom?" "My grandfather." "Show me a writing in which Arthur Bennett granted you that authority." There were conversations. "Who witnessed them?" "My father." "Anyone else?" "Malcolm Price." Eleanor placed the fee-sharing memo in front of him. At the time Mr. Price allegedly witnessed these conversations, was he promised 3% of the transaction? Daniel's attorney objected. Daniel answered anyway. "I was not aware of the details of Malcolm's compensation." Eleanor showed him an email he had sent discussing the 3% figure. Daniel read it silently. His face changed by less than an inch, but I saw it. In my work, the first visible sign of a broken system is often small. A number no longer ties out. A pause before an answer. A person reading a document longer than necessary, because the document has removed every safe direction. Eleanor moved to the trunk. "Why did you arrange for an antiques dealer to remove it before the scheduled estate sale?" He expressed interest. "At 4 in the morning. He had travel constraints." "Why did he bring a scanner?" "I don't know." She produced the dealer's statement. He had admitted Daniel paid him $10,000 to collect the trunk before I arrived and deliver all documents to Malcolm's office. He had been told he could keep or dispose of the trunk afterward. Daniel's attorney requested a break. Eleanor declined. "You described the trunk as worth $1,200. Why pay $10,000 to remove it?" "I did not pay him personally." She showed the transfer. Daniel looked toward his attorney. Then Eleanor played Grandpa's recording. The room became very still. When Grandpa's voice said, "His sons are interested," Daniel lowered his eyes. Eleanor stopped the recording. Did Arthur Bennett trust you to manage his assets? Daniel leaned back. My grandfather was suspicious in his final months. Was he correct to be suspicious? That's subjective. Did you forge his signature? No. Did you direct Heritage Estates Solutions to submit an authorization bearing his signature? I directed them to begin an assessment. That was not my question. No. Eleanor displayed a text from Scott. Signature looks close enough. H says bank won't call. H was Heritage. The bank did not call because Calvin Roque had instructed employees not to disturb an elderly client. Eleanor asked the question again. Daniel said he did not remember. That was the first time he stopped denying. Malcolm's deposition was worse. He claimed the fee-sharing memo was only a proposal. Metadata showed he had drafted it. He claimed the revocation document was created after Grandpa's death, merely to memorialize Grandpa's wishes. His own notes called it a post-death execution alternative. He claimed he had never intended to mislead the probate court. Then Eleanor produced his invoice entry. Prepare Robert narrative supporting intended revocation. Coordinate filing sequence before Claire retains independent counsel. Malcolm asked to consult his criminal attorney. The deposition ended. 2 weeks later, the county prosecutor convened a grand jury. The civil case continued separately. The probate judge held a 3-day evidentiary hearing to determine the validity of the trust amendment and whether Robert's challenge had been filed in good faith. I testified on the second day. Eleanor had told me not to perform grief, answer what is asked, do not fill silence, do not argue with counsel. The documents do not need your anger. Robert's attorney questioned why Grandpa had left me most of the trust. Did you pressure your grandfather to change his estate plan? No. Were you involved in paying his bills? Yes. So you had access to his finances? Limited access to one household checking account. You knew he was wealthy? No. You expect this court to believe you never asked what was inside a trust worth more than $11 million? I did not know the trust existed. You were his favorite. I was available. That isn't what I asked. It is the most accurate answer. He suggested I had isolated Grandpa from family. I produced calendars showing Daniel and Scott had been invited to holidays, medical appointments, and birthday dinners. They frequently canceled. He suggested Grandpa had become paranoid. I described the unauthorized payment. He suggested I had manipulated Grandpa because of financial problems after my divorce. Eleanor produced my credit reports, tax returns, and savings history. I had no unusual debts and had never received money from Grandpa beyond birthday checks and reimbursement for groceries. Then Robert's attorney asked why Grandpa trusted me. I looked toward the judge, because when he said no, I treated it as an answer. The courtroom became quiet. On the final day, Judge Ramirez issued findings from the bench. She ruled that the trust amendment was valid. She found that Grandpa had full legal capacity when he signed it. She found evidence of coordinated efforts to undermine his control, manufacture evidence of incapacity, conceal trust assets, and remove documents after his death. She referred Malcolm for disciplinary and criminal review. She permanently removed Robert from any fiduciary role. She confirmed me as successor trustee. But the most important part came near the end. The judge held up Grandpa's field notebook. Mr. Bennett appears to have understood that age was being used as a weapon against him, she said. The court will not reward those who created disorder, and then cited that disorder as proof that he could not govern his own affairs. Daniel stared straight ahead. Robert's video screen went dark before the hearing ended. The civil settlement came 6 months later. Daniel surrendered his interest in the probate estate and agreed to repay the trust for legal fees, improper transfers, and damages. His company entered bankruptcy after the developer obtained a judgment against him. Scott cooperated with prosecutors. He admitted receiving money to help remove the trunk and testified that Daniel told him Grandpa's records had to disappear before I understood their value. He received probation, restitution, and community service. Calvin Roque pleaded guilty to bank fraud and unlawful access of customer records. He lost his position and received a federal sentence. Malcolm Price resigned his law license before the disciplinary hearing. He later pleaded guilty to attempted evidence tampering, falsification, and conspiracy charges. He served time in a state facility and was ordered to pay restitution. Daniel fought longer. People like him often mistake delay for victory. He eventually entered a plea on charges related to forgery, attempted theft, and conspiracy. His sentence was not as long as some people thought it should be, but it was real. So was the judgment against him. So was the public record. Uncle Robert was not criminally charged. There was not enough evidence to prove he understood every part of the scheme, but the court found his testimony unreliable, and his relationship with Daniel collapsed under the weight of their competing stories. I have not spoken to either of them since. The trust was larger than the $11 million shown on the statement because the industrial land had appreciated significantly. After taxes, legal costs, charitable commitments, and the resolution of claims, the assets remained substantial. I did not feel rich. At first, I felt tired. There were forms to file, professionals to hire, properties to evaluate, distributions to review, and beneficiaries to notify. Becoming trustee did not feel like winning a prize. It felt like being handed the keys to a building after discovering someone had tried to remove its foundation. I kept my job for another year. That surprised people. They expected me to resign immediately. But work gave my days shape. It reminded me that I was still the same woman who checked codes, reviewed records, and brought soup in a glass container. Eventually, I reduced my hours and became a consultant for nonprofit clinics struggling with billing compliance. The trust funded a legal aid program for older adults facing financial exploitation. We named it the Arthur and June Bennett Independence Project. We did not put my name on anything. Grandpa would have preferred it that way. I bought a small house outside Columbus. Not a mansion. A white cottage with a deep porch, 2 bedrooms, and a patch of sunlight behind the garage, where I planted tomatoes, lavender, and 1 stubborn pear tree. The first spring, I placed Grandpa's old metal watering can beside the garden shed. It leaked near the bottom. I kept it anyway. The war trunk is in my study now. I had the damaged latch repaired, but I left the scratches on the lid. Inside are Grandpa's uniform, medals, letters, photographs, and field notebook. The legal documents are stored securely elsewhere. I opened every letter eventually. Most were from Grandma June. They wrote about ordinary things: weather, paychecks, a broken furnace, a neighbor's new baby, how much sugar cost, how afraid they were, how determined they were to build a quiet life after war. That was the real inheritance. Not the trust, not the land, not the royalty payments. The proof that peace is something people build deliberately, one honest decision at a time. There was one final letter from Grandpa that Eleanor gave me after the case ended. He had left it with her years earlier. Claire, you may wonder why I chose you. It was not because you needed money. It was because you never behaved as though my money completed you. Your mother had the same gift. She could enter a room without measuring what she might take from it. I built the trust because fortune attracts appetite, and appetite often disguises itself as concern. Use what I leave to protect your freedom, not replace your purpose. Keep working at something honest. Grow something. Help someone who cannot repay you. And when a polite man tells you there is no time to read twice. I cried when I reached that last line. Not loudly. Grief had changed by then. It no longer felt like a door slamming. It felt like a chair left empty in a peaceful room. I sat on the porch until the light faded from the garden. For a long time, I believed the story was about the morning I stopped my cousins from selling a trunk. It was not. The trunk was only the place where Grandpa stored the truth. The real story was about what happens when people mistake patience for weakness. Daniel thought my quietness meant I could be pressured. Malcolm thought professionalism could make dishonesty look lawful. Robert thought family loyalty required me to ignore evidence. They were all wrong. Patience is not surrender. Documentation is not cruelty. Boundaries are not betrayal. And calm does not mean powerless. I did not become free because I inherited money. I became free when I stopped allowing other people to define truth according to what benefited them. Money gave me choices, but evidence gave me justice. The court protected the trust, but self-respect protected me. Sometimes the most dangerous person in a family is not the one who shouts. It is the one who smiles, creates urgency, and asks you to trust them instead of reading what is in front of you. So I want to ask you something. What would you have done if you had found your family carrying that trunk away before sunrise? Would you have confronted them immediately, taken the settlement, or stayed quiet long enough to uncover everything? Tell me in the comments. And if this story reminded you that the truth often survives in the smallest records, share it with someone who may need that reminder. Because lies can be polished, signatures can be copied, families can apply pressure, but the truth has a weight of its own, and sooner or later, someone has to be willing to lift the lid.